A genius with an IQ of 300 encounters his most evil and dangerous enemy, leading to a tense confrontation. Margreave, Georgia. At night, a man fleeing from an unseen pursuer takes refuge under a bridge. His attacker catches up and shoots him multiple times in the back, collects the shell casings, beats the body, and hides it under some cardboard scraps. The next morning, Jack Reacher, a former military man who's now traveling across the U.S., with just a set of clothes, a toothbrush, and a few $100s, arrives in Margreave. He's here to pay his respects to Blind Blake, the famous blues musician whose work he deeply admires and who recently passed away in this town. After arriving, Jack heads to a nearby diner for a bite to eat. As he walks in, he notices a couple arguing about a tip. The man seems overly aggressive, and Jack keeps a close eye on him. The tension is enough to make the man apologize and promise to behave. Before Jack can even sample the pie, the diner is swarmed by police officers. Officers Stevenson and Baker, clearly on edge, demand Jack's compliance and threaten him with their weapons. They struggle to fit handcuffs on him and end up using plastic zip ties instead. At the station, Sheriff Roscoe Conklin and Detective Oscar Finley question Jack. He remains tight-lipped and avoids engaging with the police. Oscar tells him they're investigating a crime committed near the bridge the previous night. The victim's fingers are too swollen for fingerprints, making identification difficult. Jack listens carefully, insisting he doesn't need a lawyer because he didn't commit the crime. He acknowledges his past but asserts that he wasn't involved in this incident. Roscoe, trying to dig up information on Jack, discovers that he leads a highly secretive life with no driver's license, bank cards, or social media presence, making him nearly impossible to track. Oscar also learns that Jack has an older brother named Joe, whose whereabouts are unknown. Jack has had some past run-ins with the law, but the cases were closed due to lack of evidence. Although Jack admits he's no saint, he maintains his innocence in this case. He even deduces that the crime involved 3 people: a professional shooter, a madman who beat the corpse, and a frightened thug who covered up the scene. Despite Jack's logical analysis, Oscar decides to keep him in a cell until his alibi can be verified. As Jack Reacher reflects on his past, he recognizes a pattern. Trouble seems to follow him wherever he goes. He remembers a close call when he and his brother narrowly avoided starting a fire during a move to a new city. As teenagers, they once set out to find a creek but were waylaid by a gang of bullies demanding a toll. Jack and Joe stood their ground and effortlessly dealt with the overconfident punks. Meanwhile, Sheriff Roscoe Conklin decides to offer Jack a coffee, feeling he doesn't seem like a criminal. Their conversation is interrupted by Detective Oscar Finley, who wants to question financier Paul Hubble. Hubble's phone number was found in the victim's shoe. The businessman, visibly anxious and glancing nervously at a black car outside, eventually confesses to the crime, though he lacks details about the incident. Oscar arrests him, despite the clear signs that Hubble is making a false confession to escape his current predicament. Jack requests permission to leave and easily frees himself from the plastic ties, which had merely been a formality. In a private conversation, he showcases his sharp logic and detective skills. He picks up on subtle details about Oscar, his recent divorce, his attempts to win back his wife, his quit smoking effort, and his academic background despite being stuck in a small-town job. Jack also notices a connection between Officer Stevenson and Hubble, suspecting that Stevenson is hiding something. During the interrogation, Stevenson confirms Hubble's alibi, further suggesting Hubble's innocence. Oscar, realizing that Jack might be the only one capable of extracting information from the suspect, decides to keep both Jack and Hubble in jail temporarily. During processing, an officer conducts a thorough search, but Jack warns him to back off or face the consequences. By morning, it's apparent that Jack and Hubble are placed in a block with dangerous lifers. The inmates, sensing the newcomers, decide to make trouble and break Oscar's glasses. Jack steps in to defend the weak Hubble, taking down the gang leader with decisive force. Grateful, Hubble confesses that he was a victim of a financial scam orchestrated by his boss and fears for his family's safety if he doesn't take the fall. Later, when Jack and Hubble are heading to the bathroom, they're ambushed by a group of thugs with shivs. Jack, demonstrating his superior strength and agility, takes down the gang single-handedly, leaving the thugs incapacitated by the time the guards arrive. Roscoe, after reviewing Jack's detailed military file which highlights his heroics and numerous awards, confirms his alibi. With Jack and Hubble's release, Jack decides it's time to leave town. However, Roscoe invites him to stay and even asks him out on a date. Jack heads to the nearest barber shop for a trim. While chatting with the barber, he learns an interesting tidbit. The town is actually controlled by a businessman named Kleiner, not by a mayor. Just then, a pickup truck with Kleiner's son parks nearby. The younger Kleiner tries to intimidate Jack, but finds out that Jack is not easily intimidated. Later, Jack returns to the station, only to find that a second crime has occurred. Oscar asks for his help with a new case. At the morgue, Jack is stunned to discover that the second victim is his older brother, Joe, whom he had lost touch with years ago. Driven by a burning desire for revenge for his brother's death, Jack resolves to track down and punish everyone responsible for this heinous crime. In the evening, Jack decides to go hunting, but Oscar has asked Sheriff Roscoe to keep an eye on him to prevent any trouble. As Roscoe trails Jack, he quickly becomes aware of her presence. Unable to shake his persistent tail, Jack decides to meet with Paul Hubble to dig deeper into the businessman's connections. When Jack and Hubble visit Hubble's home, they find it empty. Hubble hasn't returned. A quick inspection reveals a piece of grass on the homeowner's shoes, leading Jack to suspect that Hubble might have been at the crime scene. They also discover that the prison inmates had planned to attack Hubble but mistook him for Jack due to his glasses. Jack heads to the crime scene and studies the area. He determines the shooter's position and concludes that while the work was professional, it was also personal. A rifle could have done the job from a distance, which suggests a deeper connection to the victim. Jack fears that Hubble might already be dead, as he likely knew too much and could endanger powerful interests in the town. That night, Jack returns to his motel, where he encounters 4 drunk men. He quickly deduces that they were hired by Kleiner's son and paid $100 each. Not interested in a lengthy confrontation, Jack warns them he'll break the arms of 3 of them, leaving the 4th to take them to the hospital. The thugs, not taking Jack's warning seriously, attack and promptly receive the injuries he promised before fleeing. Roscoe, observing from a distance, realizes that Jack is exceptionally well trained and poses a significant threat. The next morning, news breaks that 2 bodies have been discovered in the police chief's house. Rushing to the scene, Roscoe and Jack are met with a horrific sight. The police chief has been crucified, nailed to the wall, and castrated, while his wife has been brutally disposed of. This gruesome act indicates that the same individuals behind the recent crimes are responsible, making it almost certain that Hubble is dead. With the realization that most of the police officers have been compromised by influential businessmen, Jack, Roscoe, and Oscar understand that they can only trust each other. Concerned for Hubble's family's safety, Roscoe stays behind to protect them. Meanwhile, Oscar and Jack attend a citywide meeting where Mayor Grover Till is appointed as the new police chief until a more permanent solution can be found. The townspeople are nervous and view Jack with suspicion, but Kleiner Sr. pledges to do everything in his power to capture the criminals responsible for the violence. Till instructs Oscar to focus on the crime involving the deceased police chief. Lacking experience in handling such cases, Till orders a search for suspects who might have wanted revenge against the sheriff. Jack finds this approach suspicious and decides to take action. He heads back to Hubble's house and advises Hubble's wife to pack quickly. Outside, he spots a black sedan that had previously been surveilling the house and realizes it's full of Latino mercenaries, as the barber had warned him. Jack swiftly gathers Hubble's wife and children, and together with Roscoe, they hand them over to Oscar's best friend, an FBI agent tasked with protecting key witnesses. Understanding the prison guard might be a crucial lead, Jack arranges a meeting with him, pretending to be a detective. However, the guard sees through his ruse and Jack ends up caught in a trap. The Latino mercenaries threaten Jack and force him into the trunk of a car. Despite the cramped space, Jack fights back, sustaining several injuries but managing to escape just as patrol police arrive. Back at the station, Jack discovers that his brother, Joe, was working for a Secret Service agency, likely monitoring financial crimes. This connection could have led to Joe's death. The mercenaries, though formidable, are merely pawns in a larger scheme, indicating a serious operation is underway. Needing a break, Roscoe and Jack head to a bar on the state line where they can unwind without fear of recognition. They have a great time and share a romantic dance. On their way back, they're stopped due to a flooded road. Suspicious, Jack is ready for a confrontation, but it turns out to be just a natural obstacle, forcing them to spend the night in town. They check into a nearby motel, grab some snacks, and discuss their families, discovering they both lack close relatives. The next morning, they return to Roscoe's house to find the door broken open. Investigating, they find a chilling message from the criminals warning them to prepare for war. Roscoe, furious at the invasion of her hometown, refuses to let outsiders take control. Trusting Jack, she gives him a gun that belonged to her late father's friend. With it no longer safe to stay in the house, they pack up and leave, checking the gun's accuracy beforehand. They meet with Oscar and head to the morgue, where they learn the first victim was a trucker. Although he seemed insignificant, his legal interests were protected by Kleiner's company. Soon after, Joe's assistant from the Secret Service contacts Jack. She was close to Joe and is devastated by his death. While she has limited information, she reveals that Joe was involved in investigating counterfeit money and had planned to expose a major financial scandal. This could have led to a significant crackdown on fake currency, but someone silenced him before he could act. With growing evidence pointing to Kleiner's company being directly involved, Jack asks Joe's assistant to prepare documents related to his work. Jack, Oscar and Roscoe then divide the next tasks, gearing up for the next steps in their investigation. Roscoe returns to the police station, where she pretends to be investigating the criminals responsible for the attack on the deceased police chief. The mayor believes she's following his orders, checking suspects who might seek revenge against the police chief for sending them to jail. Stevenson, however, notices something odd about Roscoe's behavior and tries to talk to her. Roscoe is hesitant to be honest, suspecting Stevenson might be in league with the mayor and the influential businessmen. Meanwhile, Oscar travels to another state to locate the escaped prison guard, Spivey. Breaking down Spivey's door, Oscar finds multiple calls to Kleiner's company on the guard's phone. A vigilant neighbor reports Oscar to the local police, who then arrest and beat him, mistaking him for a burglar since he entered Spivey's house without a search warrant. Roscoe arrives in the neighboring town to free Oscar, explaining the situation to the local authorities. Back on the trail, Jack, using a fake identity, meets with the head of the legal department at the company that defended the trucker in court. Realizing that no one would willingly provide information, Jack resorts to choking the man with a telephone cord until he agrees to talk. Later, Jack, Oscar, and Roscoe gather at a roadside cafe to review the information they've collected and strategize their next steps. They agree that while many clues point to Spivey and Kleiner, they lack the substantial evidence needed to justify breaking into Kleiner's office. On their way, Jack suggests they stop to feed a dog that appears neglected. The dog belonged to the owner's deceased uncle, who hadn't been properly cared for. Oscar urges Jack to show compassion, warning that failing to do so could lead to legal trouble. Upon arriving at Kleiner's company office, Jack notices movers transporting a large amount of pet food and realizes there are no surveillance cameras. Inside, the office is filled with taxidermy, indicating the Kleiner family's passion for hunting. When Oscar inquires about Spivey's calls and the trucker's defense, Kleiner has ready answers, advising them to leave him alone and find the real criminals. His dismissive attitude angers Oscar, who vows to uncover the truth. After their meeting with Kleiner, Jack advises Oscar to find a motel outside of town for safety, as they may become targets. Jack and Roscoe suspect that the movers were actually transporting money hidden in pet food packaging. Later, Roscoe encounters Kleiner Jr., who warns her that Jack is a criminal with a history of harming both military personnel and civilians. Roscoe, unconvinced and suspecting Kleiner Jr. of involvement in the counterfeiting operation, tells him to leave her alone. In the evening, Oscar meets with Hubbell's former boss and learns that Hubbell had left her company over a year ago. Hubbell had deceived his family about his whereabouts, so no one knows where he was actually working. Returning to the motel, Oscar finds solace in a drink and meets a woman who notices his loneliness. Despite her interest, Oscar, still grieving his ex-wife and unable to move on, declines her company, unable to fully embrace the present. Jack returns to the bar where Spivey was last seen. He tries to gather information from one of the impoverished patrons, but the bouncer quickly shuts him down, refusing to let him ask too many questions. Jack, undeterred, takes down the bouncer and forces him to reveal that Spivey left with 2 Latino mercenaries. As Jack exits the bar, he spots the same mercenaries tailing him. He quickly heads back inside, grabs a pair of latex gloves, and leaves the bar once more. Realizing the mercenaries are still on his trail, Jack devises a plan. He lures them into a trap by leading them to a remote spot and then makes a daring escape by jumping out of his moving vehicle. The mercenaries, confused but determined, investigate the abandoned car, only for Jack to ambush them, shooting them in the back. After searching the bodies, Jack decides to hide them in the trunk, only to find that it's already occupied by the missing Spivey's corpse. Without getting too worked up, Jack methodically breaks the legs of the mercenaries and manages to stuff them into the trunk alongside Spivey's corpse. Soon after, Oscar calls to inform him that Joe's burned car has been found. They head to the scene, where they examine the charred remains of the SUV, uncertain if it truly belonged to Jack's late brother. After noting down the VIN number to verify the vehicle's information, Jack confesses to Oscar that he killed the 2 Latino mercenaries and found Spivey's body. Roscoe, learning that the killings weren't in self-defense but driven by revenge, feels conflicted. However, her personal feelings for Jack lead her to sympathize with him. She's also curious about what really happened in Baghdad, which Kleiner Jr. had hinted at. Jack explains that he had protected local children by executing several men who had been tormenting them. To dispose of the car and the bodies, Jack and Roscoe drive to the nearest airport. Jack temporarily disables the security cameras, allowing Roscoe to park the car and wipe away any fingerprints. They then spend the night at a nearby hotel, where Jack rents a suite using the cash he took from the dead mercenaries. As a precaution, he sets up toothpicks on the door as a trap, worrying that someone might discover them. Meanwhile, Joe's assistant calls, promising to have the case files ready and to meet them the next evening. Roscoe, feeling less concerned about their ongoing problems, decides to join Jack in the shower, leading to a moment of intimacy between them. The next morning, Mayor Till orders Oscar to focus on finding the repeat offenders who attacked the police chief. Oscar, knowing he must comply to avoid being fired for his previous treatment of Kleiner Sr., reluctantly agrees. Around the same time, Picard calls, claiming he has valuable information and suggesting a meeting. Leaving Hubble's wife and children behind, Picard gives them a gun for protection and then heads out to meet Roscoe and Jack. Meanwhile, Jack and Roscoe visit the wife of the deceased trucker. She reveals that she suspected her husband was involved in something illegal, as his lifestyle didn't match his income. She guesses he was transporting and stealing air conditioners, but Jack suspects something far more complex, counterfeit money being produced in South America and then transported to Kleiner in the US. Later, Jack and Roscoe meet with Picard, who confirms that Joe had rented the burned car. They also learn which hotel Joe stayed at, and they head there to collect his personal belongings. However, they discover that other mercenaries had arrived first, taking a briefcase full of documents and tossing the remaining items into a dumpster. Jack, sifting through the discarded items, finds a new clue left by his late brother. As they piece together the evidence, the Latinos return, guns blazing, intent on killing Jack and Roscoe. In the chaos, Jack urges Roscoe to split up, leading the attackers away from her. He manages to take down one of the mercenaries, but the other corners him. In a tense moment, Roscoe appears and kills the second mercenary, saving Jack. Frustrated and shaken, Roscoe expresses her anger at Jack for putting her in danger. Jack explains that he had no other choice because she's the only person that truly matters to him. Meanwhile, Oscar grows suspicious, realizing that the mercenaries were able to track them down. He concludes that someone within the police department must have overheard his conversation with Picard and set up the ambush. Oscar, Roscoe, and Jack gather to review the new clues. They discover 3 phone numbers among Joe's belongings, and after making some calls, they learn that one number belongs to an environmental agency, while the other 2 are linked to economics professors from universities in neighboring states. The case grows increasingly complex and Jack reaches out to Frances Neagley, a private investigator he trusts. He asks her to dig deeper into the backgrounds of the professors, especially focusing on their trips to Europe. With the expectation that Joe's assistant, Molly, will provide crucial documents, the trio heads to the train station. They spot Molly in the distance and wait for her to approach, but as time passes and she doesn't arrive, Jack grows concerned. He goes searching for Molly and finds her bleeding out, with all the documents stolen. Not wanting to become suspects in a crime, the trio quickly flees the scene, leaving Molly's body in a tunnel. On their way to the station, they spot a mistreated dog and decide to free it, giving the abusive owner a lesson they won't forget. Afterward, they head to Hubble's house, where Jack grabs a new, bullet-free car and drives to Kleiner's cattle farm. He's troubled by the fact that Kleiner's company is buying an unusually large amount of feed. While there, Jack also notices grass identical to what he saw on Hubble's shoes. When they arrive at the station, Jack notices an insulting message scrawled on Roscoe's car. Knowing exactly who's behind it, he tracks down Kleiner Jr. at a nearby cafe. Jack tries to keep things calm, but when Kleiner Jr. insults Roscoe again, Jack feels he must defend her honor. Kleiner Jr. tries to call Roscoe an easy girl, earning himself a hard slap. His buddies jump in, but Jack easily takes down the trio of cocky guys. The fight is interrupted when Oscar and Roscoe arrive at the cafe. Kleiner Sr. witnesses the confrontation and warns them to stop, hinting that Jack will be arrested if things escalate further. Oscar manages to smooth things over, understanding that Kleiner Sr. wouldn't want the situation to go to court, where his son's unpleasant behavior might come to light. Meanwhile, Mayor Teal fires Roscoe for neglecting her duties. With most of their leads lost, Jack inquires about the late Detective Gray, who was a friend of Roscoe's father. Remembering a box with a gun, Jack examines it and finds a key, which leads them to a barbershop. There, Oscar, Roscoe, and Jack discover a chest containing personal items and documents Gray had collected during his last investigation. Jack remains puzzled by Kleiner Sr.'s excessive feed purchases. Interestingly, Kleiner bought 116 cows when 120 are needed to be considered a legitimate farmer. In Gray's documents, the trio finds evidence that a charitable foundation is actually a front for laundering counterfeit money, as its expenses far exceed the donations and contributions from patrons. It's becoming increasingly clear that Kleiner Sr. is a criminal using the town as a hub to receive and distribute counterfeit money, supporting other criminals and terrorists in the process. Amid all this, Jack reflects on his lifelong stubbornness and uncompromising nature. He recalls a time when he and his brother beat up some bullies, one of whom was a general's son. Their father could have faced trouble at work, and they were pressured to apologize, but Jack never compromised his principles. Soon after, Neagley contacts Jack, saying she's found some useful information and asks to meet. Jack thinks he knows her well enough to easily find her, but it's Neagley who anticipates his moves and meets him at the right cafe. Through her investigation, Neagley discovered a similar small town in Arkansas where a series of crimes were committed. The local police were wiped out, and the town fell into ruin after the water supply was contaminated. When Jack visits Arkansas and speaks with a local, he realizes the town was destroyed by a small company also owned by Kleiner Sr. Meanwhile, Roscoe decides to follow up on Jack's suspicions and heads to the morgue. After speaking with the morgue worker, she discovers that Gray's death wasn't a suicide as it seemed. He was actually struck on the head, and the injury was made to look like a suicide attempt. The wound even has traces that resemble diamond-shaped corners. Realizing that the mayor is likely behind this, Roscoe rushes to confront Teal and ends up beating him. As a result, she's not only fired but also faces arrest for assault. Oscar helps her flee the town, and she ultimately decides to take over as the bodyguard for Hubbell's family, replacing Picard. That evening, Neagley and Jack meet with some cops who are assisting with their investigation. They learn that a hitman known as Viking might be involved in the crimes. On their way back, they find out that one of the cops has been bribed by the businessmen. The corrupt cop kills his partner and tries to execute Neagley and Jack, but they narrowly escape by causing a car accident. The corrupt cop begs for help but ultimately decides to drown himself, knowing that if he survives and fails his mission, his family will suffer. Later that night, Oscar breaks into Kleiner Sr.'s office, hoping to find evidence of his guilt. Instead, he discovers Kleiner Sr.'s dead body and realizes that the businessman wasn't the real mastermind after all. After learning what happened, Jack realizes that a key figure in the criminal organization is based in Venezuela. With Kleiner Sr. out of the picture, it's crucial to figure out what happens next, but they need surveillance and a discreet vehicle. Back at the station, Oscar plays it cool and pretends he knows nothing about the crime. Mayor Teal suspends him from the investigation due to his conflict with the deceased, and Teal's son takes a swing at Oscar. Jack and Oscar rent an old, inconspicuous car from a mechanic and head into the woods to keep an eye on Kleiner Sr.'s former company. During their surveillance, Oscar opens up about his past, revealing that he left town after his wife passed away. They never divorced, he just felt responsible for her death and chose to isolate himself, even quitting smoking. While they're watching, they see Kleiner Sr.'s nephew leave in a truck and decide to follow him, suspecting he's transporting counterfeit money. At night, the driver stops at a motel and goes to bed. Jack and Oscar, staying hidden and cautious, check the truck but find it empty. Losing another lead, Jack calls the professors, assuming they've returned from Europe. One has already been killed, but the second professor is still alive. Jack urges her to seek police help before he arrives. Meanwhile, Roscoe checks in with Hubbell's wife and children to ensure their safety while Picard is away. That evening, she spots a car nearby and suspects they're being followed. She sends Charlie and the kids to the basement and heads into the woods toward the light source, discovering a vehicle with Latino mercenaries. They spot her and start hunting her down. Roscoe instructs Hubbell's family to flee and hide in the forest while she distracts the mercenaries. Acting quickly and strategically, Roscoe injures one of them. The second mercenary tries to use a grenade, but Roscoe blinds him with wooden splinters, causing him to drop the grenade, which then explodes, killing him. The next morning, Roscoe reunites with Charlie and the kids. They call Picard and head to a nearby cafe. Realizing her family is in danger, Charlie admits she knew about her husband's work. A year ago, Kleiner Sr. had offered Hubbell an extremely lucrative deal, which turned out to be a trap. Hubbell got caught up in financial scams and was forced to take the job after witnessing one of the guilty employees being crucified. Soon, Picard arrives at the cafe and takes everyone to a safer location. Jack arrives in New York and buys a suit to meet with the professor. She explains that the counterfeit money Kleiner Sr. was distributing wasn't just fake. He was producing $100 bills. It's likely he had access to special paper and printing presses capable of making bills indistinguishable from real ones. Noticing a former military officer among the police, Jack asks him to protect the professor in the coming days. As Jack leaves the precinct, he realizes he's being followed. He manages to lure the mercenary into a quiet alley and engages in a fight, professionally incapacitating and killing him. That evening, Stevenson and his wife discuss the possibility of moving away due to the city's dangers and their impending child. Unfortunately, it's too late. 4 criminals in latex suits, responsible for the crimes in Margrove, arrive at their home. When Jack returns to town, he and Oscar attend Kleiner Sr.'s funeral but face hostility from the crowd. Shortly after, they learn that Stevenson and his wife have been executed. The nature of their injuries, torture for Stevenson and mistreatment for his pregnant wife, confirms that Stevenson wasn't involved with the criminals. Mayor Teal fires Oscar, blaming him for failing to capture the criminals and restore order. Feeling a sense of duty, Oscar goes to inform Stevenson's parents about the tragedy. Meanwhile, Jack decides to question the only surviving active police officer, Baker. Suspecting Baker might be colluding with the gang in the white latex suits, Jack pretends to be an ally, claiming he wants to search Hubbell's house for evidence. He sets a trap by buying clothing and equipment for an ambush. Jack turns on the lights and loud music, paints his face for battle, and hides in the bushes nearby. A pickup truck soon arrives with armed thugs, including Kleiner Sr.'s nephew. The 4 in white suits enter the house, unaware that Jack is lurking. As they search the house, Jack takes out their driver and signals with a light. he lures one of the criminals outside and silently dispatches him. Jack then opens the front door, kills the second thug, and hides inside. The third thug tries to track him by the wet footprints, but it's a trap, and he becomes the next victim. Only Kleiner Sr.'s nephew is left, and he shoots at Jack and attacks him with a crowbar. During the struggle, the criminal hits Jack on the head and tries to drown him in the pool, but Jack manages to grab a gun and shoot him. After dealing with the criminals and cleaning up the scene, Jack notices some damp paper and suddenly realizes how Kleiner Sr. obtained the paper for the counterfeit bills. Since $1 and $100 bills are the same size, Hubble had suggested to Kleiner Sr. that they wash the ink from $1 bills and reprint them as $100s. The ink had caused environmental damage in Arkansas, prompting Kleiner Sr. to relocate and buy a farm. The feed and fertilizers on the farm contain a special chemical element that neutralizes the ink's effects, making their operation environmentally safe. Jack shares this insight with Roscoe, who informs Picard of the breakthrough. Meanwhile, 3 hitmen have tracked Oscar, and he needs help. Jack remotely advises him, allowing Oscar to break through a wall into a neighboring room and escape through a window. As the mercenaries storm into the room, Oscar makes it to his car and drives off, shooting out the tires of their vehicle. The next morning, they decide to check the late trucker's house, but it's been burned down to cover the criminal's tracks. Jack suddenly realizes that the note from his brother refers to the trucker's parents' house and heads there. Finding boxes of counterfeit money, Jack prepares to capture the entire criminal ring. Shortly afterward, Neagley calls Jack and reveals that the Arkansas crimes were orchestrated by a corrupt FBI agent, Picard. Jack had already suspected this when he saw Oscar being held hostage by Picard, Teal, and Kleiner Jr. During their conversation, it becomes clear that Kleiner Jr. has eliminated everyone in his path: Joe, his police colleagues, the mayor, and others. His derangement is so extreme that he even executed his own father to take over the family business and set up a counterfeit money operation in neighboring countries. The only person he hasn't found is Hubble, whose family is now being held hostage. Kleiner Jr. gives Jack until morning to find the escaped financier and bring him to the company's warehouse. With no other options, the former soldier turns to detective work. Under constant surveillance by Picard, Jack heads to a cafe and uses his knowledge of fugitive behavior to deduce where Hubble might be hiding. To gain an advantage, Jack spills hot coffee on Picard and steals a fork to puncture the tires of his car. The resulting flat tire forces them to stop, which Jack uses to open the trunk, discovering it's filled with weapons. Realizing that neither of them benefits from a shootout, Jack proposes they put down their weapons. It's a trick. He ends up shooting Picard, who manages to escape into a ditch. Jack then finds Hubble and learns the details of his brother's death. Meanwhile, Baker beats Oscar and locks him in a cell. Soon, a message arrives on Oscar's phone instructing him to find a safe place. The corrupt officer doesn't understand the message until a pickup truck crashes into the police station, making him a casualty of the chaos. Oscar watches with satisfaction as the officer dies, and then he, Jack, and Hubble raid the weapons safe. They're soon joined by Neagley, who had guessed her former boss was in trouble and offers her help. Taking refuge in a barbershop, the group devises a plan and scouts the area to locate where the hostages are being held. Just before dawn, they launch their attack on the warehouse. Neagley takes out 2 guards outside, and Jack finishes off the remaining one. Realizing they might not survive until morning, Oscar lights a fire to create a diversion. Hubble sneaks into the warehouse and guides his daughters to safety. During a fierce shootout, Neagley, Jack, and Oscar eliminate the gang members and Latin American mercenaries. Jack also frees Roscoe and Charlie, enabling their escape. As a police officer, Roscoe can't stay out of the action and returns to help take down the remaining criminals. Wounded, Picard arrives for a final confrontation with Oscar. Oscar defeats his treacherous friend and crushes him in a press. Meanwhile, Roscoe encounters the mayor and handcuffs him to a pipe. Teal tries to resist and grabs a gun, but Roscoe quickly takes him out, punishing the traitor who betrayed his city. The only ones left in the warehouse are Kleiner Jr. and Jack. Confident of his victory, Kleiner Jr. is caught off guard by Jack's sound trap. Jack attacks from behind, beats Kleiner Jr., and throws him into the burning money, eliminating him once and for all. The warehouse explodes, but Jack escapes unscathed, embodying the true hero. With Hubble and his family safe, Roscoe and Jack spend the night together. The next morning, the FBI arrives, but Jack avoids talking to them and is forced to leave town. He says goodbye to Roscoe, promising they'll meet again, and takes her phone number to stay in touch. Remembering how his mother gave him a bravery medal, Jack struggles to hold back tears, feeling that Joe deserved it just as much. He visits the site where his brother's body was found and buries the medal nearby. Finally, Jack bids farewell to Oscar and tries the pie he's been tempted by since day one. With his mission complete, he sets off on another cross-country journey, carrying only a toothbrush and a few $100s. If you had the chance to print counterfeit money, where would you spend it? Share your ideas in the comments down below.